There is a house at the end of a long red road in the centre of London, where the morning light comes up through an avenue of plane trees, and where, on a wet day, the air still carries the smell of rain on stone and the faint ammonia tang of cavalry horses. You have seen it 10,000 times. The east front runs 350 feet across, faced in pale Portland stone, with a balcony at its centre and a flagpole on its roof. Behind that front are 775 rooms, 19 staterooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, 78 bathrooms. Behind the rooms lie 39 acres of walled garden, the largest private garden in London, with a lake, a tennis court, and 3,500 trees. Around 500 people work here. The building is the backdrop to coronations, jubilees, weddings, and funerals, and its name is shorthand across the whole world for the British monarchy itself. What you are looking at is the most recognizable building on earth. What you are looking at is also a house that its own family spent 200 years trying to escape. Not a home, not a refuge, not even, for most of its existence, a place anyone chose. Buckingham Palace is where a king poured out the price of a small war and died without sleeping a single night inside, where his brother refused to move in and tried to give the building away to Parliament, where a grieving queen closed the shutters for so long that Londoners pinned a mock for sale notice to the railings, where 9 German bombs fell in a single war, and where, in June 2026, a paragraph in a financial report quietly confirmed what the family had privately understood for generations: no king or queen will ever live here again. This is the dark story of Britain's most famous address, the story of the house every monarch resented. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a duke and a failed silk farm. In 1608, King James V planted a garden of mulberry trees on rising ground west of Westminster, 4 acres of them, because he had decided that England should break the French and Italian grip on silk. Silkworms feed on the white mulberry. James, or the men who advised him, planted the black. The worms sickened, the silk never came, and the mulberry garden decayed into a pleasure ground where Samuel Pepys went drinking and called it, in his diary, a silly place. The scheme failed completely. The ground remembered. Every wall that has ever stood on this site since has stood, in part, on the king's failed mulberry garden, and on the awkward fact that the crown never quite let go of the freehold. The ground then passed through a century of ambitious and unlucky tenants. George Goring, Earl of Norwich, raised the first great house on the site in the 1630s and never managed to buy the freehold of the mulberry ground beneath his own garden, a clerical failure that would echo down 200 years. His successor, Henry Bennet, Earl of Arlington, one of the most powerful ministers of Charles II's court, watched Goring House burn to the ground in 1674 with his pictures, his plate, and his papers inside it, and rebuilt on the ashes as Arlington House. Fire, debt, and disappointed ambition, the site had a character long before it had a palace, and in 1703 it came to John Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham, and Normanby. He was a poet praised by Dryden, a soldier who had gone to sea against the Dutch as a teenager, and a Tory grandee of monumental self-regard who had, years earlier, courted the future Queen Anne, closely enough to be banished from court for it, and who never entirely stopped reminding people of it. When Anne took the throne in 1702, he collected his dukedom. What he wanted next was a house that said everything his career had not quite managed to say. Sheffield demolished Arlington House and built something deliberately provocative. His architect was William Winday, working in the orbit of designs by William Talman, and the house he raised in 1703 was a broad red brick block with stone dressings, flanked by service wings, set on a rise so that it stared straight down the tree-lined mall towards St. James's Palace, the official seat of the monarchy, a subject's house, positioned like a full stop at the end of the royal avenue. Visitors approached, as the Duke himself wrote with satisfaction, through rows of goodly elms. Across the garden front, he had a Latin motto set up in letters large enough to read from the park: Sic Citi Laetantur Lares. The household gods delight in such a situation. The message was not subtle. Buckingham House looked down the throat of the Crown's own processional route, and the Crown noticed. There was a flaw in the boast. Part of the garden stood on the old mulberry ground, held from the Crown on a lease, and for all his letters and lawyers, the Duke never secured the whole freehold. He died in 1721 beneath his own painted ceilings. His widow Catherine, an illegitimate daughter of King James II, held the house for 2 decades more and ran it as a court in exile, receiving guests seated beneath a canopy of state and keeping formal mourning on her Stuart anniversaries, royalty in everything but the constitutional detail. By the middle of the century, the family line was guttering. The Crown's lease was a live threat hanging over the garden, and the house at the end of the mall was, quietly, for sale. The buyer was a king who wanted to disappear. In 1761, George III, 22 years old and newly on the throne, bought Buckingham House from the Duke's illegitimate son, Sir Charles Sheffield, for £21,000, a sum in the region of £5 million in modern money, and worth every penny to a young man who could not bear the place he was supposed to live. St. James's Palace was cramped, public and ceremonial, a warren of levees and drawing rooms where a king was on display from breakfast onward. George III kept it for business. Buckingham House was for everything else. Here is the irony on which this entire story turns. The most famous palace on earth entered royal hands as an escape from palace life. The king bought it as a private retreat for his new wife. He had married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz at St. James's on 8th of September 1761, a date that will return in this story 261 years later. And within a year, the couple had withdrawn to the house at the end of the mall. It became known simply as the Queen's House, and in 1775 an Act of Parliament settled it on Charlotte formally. They lived there as almost no royal couple had lived before. The king filled the house with books, 65,000 volumes in time, built the Octagon Library to hold them, and rose early to read while the fires were laid. Charlotte filled it with children. 14 of her 15 were born in the Queen's House, in rooms that smelled of milk, candle smoke, and ink rather than ceremony. Evenings were music, cards, and needlework. Courtiers found it dull, beyond endurance. The family found it bearable, which for this family was rare. The house even had its one perfect scene. In February 1767, Dr. Samuel Johnson, working in the King's Library, looked up to find George III had come in quietly by a private door to talk with him about books, universities, and the writing of lives. The two men stood among the shelves and simply conversed, king and subject, in a room built for reading rather than for reverence. Johnson dined out on the story for years. It is difficult to imagine any comparable scene in the gilded palace this house was about to become. And in fact, nothing comparable ever happened there again. The Queen's House worked precisely because it was not a palace. It asked nothing of its occupants but that they live in it. No monarch would ever feel that way about the building again, because the next king to touch it made sure there was nothing left to feel it about. George IV had waited longer for the throne than any heir before him, and waiting had made him extravagant in the way that standing water goes stale. He became king on 29th January 1820, 57 years old. Gout-ridden, corseted, brilliant in taste, and catastrophic with money. As Prince of Wales, he had poured fortunes into Carlton House, his residence on Pall Mall, until it was reckoned among the most sumptuous houses in Europe, and more fortunes into the seaside fantasy of the Brighton Pavilion. It made no difference. Within 5 years of his accession, he declared Carlton House inadequate for a king, ordered it demolished, and sold the site for terraces. Its salvaged columns were carted off and stand today in the portico of the National Gallery. A house that had swallowed decades of public money was thrown away like a toy outgrown. Then he turned his eye up the Mall to his parents' old retreat. What he proposed to Parliament in 1825 was a repair. The word mattered. Parliament would fund improvements to an existing royal house. It would not fund a new palace for a king it did not trust with money. So the fiction was agreed, and the king's architect was appointed to execute it. John Nash, then aged 73, the man who had already carved Regent Street and Regent's Park through London, a small, shrewd, charming builder of scenery who had never in his life brought a project in on budget. The estimate put before Parliament was a little over £250,000. What Nash actually began from 1825 was the demolition of the Queen's House in all but name. The old red brick disappeared behind gleaming Bathstone. The house was doubled in depth, raised, and extended into two long wings embracing a forecourt. A triumphal arch of white Carrara marble, celebrating the victories of Trafalgar and Waterloo, was raised as the ceremonial gate. The private retreat of George III was being converted, block by block, into the most expensive building project in Europe. Inside, Nash built pure theatre, a grand staircase, with a gilt bronze balustrade that cost more than most country houses. A music room with a great curved bow and columns of imitation lapis. Drawing rooms hung with silk, ceilings crusted with gilded plaster, doors of mahogany taller than coach houses. The king, old and ailing, came to walk the shell with his architect and change his mind, and every change was priced in thousands. He was not building a home, and both men knew it. He was building a stage set for a monarchy whose real power was already draining away to Parliament, a last argument in stone that the crown still mattered. Whether he ever intended to sleep there is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that he never did. The money did not so much overrun as dissolve. By 1829, the accounts showed roughly £496,000 spent, nearly double the estimate, on a house that stood unfinished behind scaffolding, and the true bill was still climbing towards £700,000, comfortably over 60 million in modern terms. The press mocked the dome, which rose over the garden front like an apology. Parliament raged at the arch. The Treasury demanded schedules Nash could not produce, because they had never existed. A select committee began circling the whole undertaking like a coroner at an inquest. Called to account in 1828, Nash could explain the beauty of everything and the cost of almost nothing. Asked when the palace would be finished and what it would finally come to, the old man could only offer estimates that everyone in the room knew would be wrong, because every estimate before them had been wrong. Members questioned whether the new wings were even structurally sound. The palace had become, in the space of 4 years, a byword for royal waste, debated in the Commons while a dying king altered the drawings again. But the deepest problem was not the cost, it was the client. The king, who had commissioned a palace of appearances, no longer wished to appear. Through the late 1820s, George IV withdrew to Windsor, swollen, half-blind, dosed with laudanum, receiving almost no one. The house on the Mall was rising. The man it was rising for was sinking. He inspected drawings, altered plans, doubled costs with a pencil stroke, and never once slept a night under the roof that was consuming his reputation. He never would. On 26th of June 1830, at Windsor Castle, George IV died in the early hours of the morning, and the palace he had bled the Treasury to build stood empty, unfinished and unloved at the end of the Mall. He had spent the equivalent of a small war on it. He had never lived in it for a single night. Remember the date of his death. This story will end in the same week of the same month, 196 years later. The reckoning was immediate. Within weeks, a select committee of Parliament had Nash before it, 78 years old now, answering for accounts that answered for nothing. The Duke of Wellington's government dismissed him from the works in 1830, stripped him of the commission that should have crowned his career, and handed the half-built palace to a cheaper, duller, safer man, Edward Blore, with instructions to finish it plainly and quickly. Nash retired to the Isle of Wight in disgrace and died there 5 years later. The palace's first architect was its first casualty. Its second was supposed to be its first resident. William IV, the Sailor King, George IV's brother, inherited the throne at 64 and inherited the palace with it. He took one look and declined. He was comfortable where he was, in Clarence House, the modest London home Nash had built for him in the 1820s, and no argument of state could move him. Hold that detail. A king refusing Buckingham Palace because he preferred Clarence House is how this story begins, its long middle, and it is exactly how the story will end. William did more than refuse. He tried to get rid of the building altogether. On the night of 16th of October 1834, the Palace of Westminster caught fire, and by morning, the ancient home of Parliament was a smoking shell beside the Thames. William, seeing his chance, promptly offered Buckingham Palace to the nation as a replacement, a ready-made Parliament, free to a good home. The Commons considered the gift and turned it down. The building was thought unsuitable, and perhaps they suspected what the king was really doing. He was trying to hand back the white elephant. He died in June 1837, having never spent a night there, the second king in succession to refuse the most expensive house in Europe, which is how it fell to a girl of 18. Victoria became queen on 20th of June 1837, and on 13th of July 1837, 3 weeks into her reign, she moved into Buckingham Palace, the first sovereign ever to live there. For her, the move was liberation. It took her out of Kensington Palace, away from her suffocating mother and the regime that had controlled every hour of her childhood. She recorded her delight in her journal, danced past midnight at palace balls, and for a few bright years the building finally had what it was built for: a court, music in the state rooms, candlelight in the windows. The house repaid her in kind, which is to say, badly. Nash's palace turned out to be magnificent scenery and miserable plumbing. Chimneys smoked so badly that fires could not be lit, and the staterooms stood cold. Ventilation shafts carried kitchen stench into the gilded saloons. The drains were defective, the bell pulls broke, the windows would not open, and the smell of the sewers rose through the floors. When Victoria married Prince Albert on 10th of February 1840, the methodical German prince walked into the most famous new building in Europe and found it, in plain terms, a badly run building site, where candle ends were a servant's perquisite, and nobody could say who was responsible for cleaning the windows. Albert spent years imposing order on the household and its accounts. The palace could not even keep people out. Between 1838 and 1841, an undersized teenage boy named Edward Jones broke into the building repeatedly, and the newspapers, half horrified and half delighted, made the boy, Jones, famous. He was found with the Queen's linen stuffed under his coat. He claimed to have sat upon the throne. In December 1840, days after Victoria gave birth to her first child, he was discovered hidden beneath a sofa in a room next to the Queen's own bedroom. Twice examined, twice locked away, he kept coming back. And the authorities finally solved the problem by putting him in the Navy and shipping him beyond reach of them all. Remember the boy under the sofa. In this house, that scene will happen again, a century and a half later, with the reigning monarch present. As the children came, 9 of them, the couple pressed Parliament for a 4th wing to hold the growing family. Blore built the east front across Nash's open courtyard in the late 1840s, paid for in part by selling George IV's Brighton Pavilion, and the Marble Arch, too narrow now for its position and its purpose, was carted away in 1851 and re-erected at the corner of Hyde Park. It stands there today, a triumphal gate, a mile from the palace it was built to serve, the first piece of physical evidence in this story that the building never quite worked. The new east front had a balcony. In 1851, Victoria stepped onto it during the celebrations for the Great Exhibition, and a tradition was born on the front of a wing built to house nurseries. For 1 decade, and really only one, Buckingham Palace was a happy royal home. Then, On 14th of December 1861, Albert died of typhoid at Windsor, and Victoria's world stopped. She withdrew into mourning so total that it emptied the palace at the heart of the empire. She fled to Windsor, to Osborne, to Balmoral, anywhere the memory of her husband did not wear a crown. The blinds came down on the Mall. The staterooms went under dust sheets. Courtiers came to call the greatest building in London simply what it was, an empty palace. London noticed, and London's patience ran out. In 1864, with the Queen still invisible 3 years after Albert's death, a notice appeared pinned to the palace railings in the style of an estate agent's bill. It read, "These commanding premises to be let or sold in consequence of the late occupant's declining business." The joke was reported everywhere, and it cut because it was true. The sovereign's official residence stood dark for the better part of 4 decades, while its owner lived elsewhere. Republican feeling in the 1860s and 1870s fed on that darkness. Newspapers asked openly what the nation was paying for, and ministers begged the Queen, year after year, simply to be seen in her own capital. She returned for occasions, a wedding, 2 jubilees, a wave from Bloor's balcony, and each time the blinds came down again behind her. The first monarch who actually lived in Buckingham Palace spent 40 years demonstrating that she would rather live anywhere else. Her son was the exception that proves everything. Albert Edward, Bertie, had been born in the palace on 9th of November 1841, and when he succeeded as Edward VII in 1901, he attacked his mother's mausoleum with a cigar in his mouth, famously dismissing the dead decades with the word sepulchre. As courtiers of the day recorded, he ripped out the gloom, installed electric light, redecorated in white and gold, and threw the palace open. Under Edward VII, the building blazed for the first time in half a century, with state balls, ambassadors, actresses on the staircases, and the smell of cigar smoke in the corridors. The palace absorbed him as it absorbed everything, and for 9 years it was what Nash had promised, the most glittering court in Europe. In 1913, the architect Aston Webb refaced Bloor's crumbling east front in pale Portland stone, the work completed in a matter of weeks. The most famous facade on earth, the one on the postcards and the news broadcasts, has been there barely a century, a mask fixed to the front of an older disappointment. George VI, stammering, dutiful, never meant to be king, was carried into the palace by his brother's abdication in 1936 and made no secret of what he found there. He called Buckingham Palace an icebox, and the family's own accounts of the period describe endless corridors, freezing bathrooms, and food arriving cold from kitchens a quarter of a mile of passageway away. His daughter inherited the building in 1952 and served it faithfully for 70 years without ever pretending it was home. Elizabeth II was privately reported by biographers and courtiers to regard the palace as the office, and Windsor Castle as the place her heart lived. In March 2020, she left the palace for Windsor, and she never came back to live. She died at Balmoral on 8th of September 2022. And so, on 18th September 2022, 261 years to the day after George III married the wife he bought Buckingham House to shelter, Charles III became king, and the quiet 2-century pattern completed itself. He did not move in. He remained at Clarence House, the same house from which William IV had refused the palace nearly 2 centuries before. For 4 years, the official line held that a decision would follow the building works. In the last week of June 2026, in the sober pages of the annual royal accounts, the decision arrived, and it was the one every king since George IV had already made in his heart. The house at the end of the Mall had outlasted the pretense. But before that announcement could be understood, the palace had 1 more century of punishment to absorb, and it began with the sound of an aircraft following the Thames in the rain. On 13th September 1940, at around 11 o'clock on a wet Friday morning, a lone German raider came up the Mall beneath low cloud and dropped a stick of bombs directly onto Buckingham Palace. 2 exploded in the inner quadrangle, perhaps 30 yards from where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were sitting in an upstairs room, blowing out the windows around them. Another wrecked the palace chapel. Others struck the forecourt and the garden. 4 workmen below stairs were caught in the blast, and one of them later died of his injuries. The king and queen walked down into the wreckage, shaken and unhurt, while glass was still settling on the carpets. The king wrote an account of that morning in his diary. The aircraft hurled through the rain, the 2 bombs seen falling past the window into the quadrangle, the detonations, the staff hurrying through corridors carpeted with glass. We all wondered why we weren't dead, he recorded. The German crew had used the one weapon the palace could not answer, the straight line of the mall itself, the processional avenue laid out for state carriages, serving for 90 seconds as a bombing run. Wartime life inside the palace was deliberately, publicly austere. Windows were boarded where the glass had gone, the staterooms were shut, the family ate rationed food served on gold plate, and a painted line in the bathtubs marked the 5 inches of hot water allowed to anyone, king included. When Eleanor Roosevelt stayed in 1942, she recorded the cold, the boarded windows, and the smallness of the fires in the grandest building she had ever slept in. The king practiced with a revolver in the garden and said that if the invasion came, he intended to use it. The palace, for once in its history, was exactly what the country needed it to be: uncomfortable, defiant, and visibly shared in. The palace was hit 9 times during the war, but it was the September attack that entered the national bloodstream because of a single sentence. The East End of London was being burned out street by street, and there had been resentment, real and dangerous, that the rich slept safe in the West. Surveying her own bomb damage, Queen Elizabeth said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The line is documented, endlessly quoted, and it did precisely what it described. The King and Queen went to the East End the same afternoon and stood in streets that were still smoking. Here is the uncomfortable truth beneath the finest hour. The palace's greatest service to the monarchy was being damaged. Empty of majesty for so much of its life, the building was most useful to the crown as a casualty. The ruined chapel was never rebuilt as a chapel. In 1962, its shell reopened as the Queen's Gallery, a public exhibition space, the first sliver of the palace ever open to ordinary ticket holders, and a quiet rehearsal for everything that has happened since. The post-war palace settled into its long modern role, offices behind a ceremonial mask, and the mask was thinner than anyone admitted. At around 7:15 on the morning of the 9th of July, 1982, an unemployed decorator named Michael Fagan scaled the railings, climbed a drainpipe, wandered unchallenged through the corridors, and sat down on the end of the Queen's bed in her private apartment, dripping blood from a cut hand onto the bedclothes. Elizabeth II woke to find a stranger in her room in the most protected building in Britain. Her calls to the police switchboard went unanswered for minutes. She kept him talking. A footman, Paul Wybrew, finally helped detain him. It was Fagan's second visit. He had been inside the palace weeks earlier and helped himself to a bottle of wine. The scandal that followed stripped the last illusion that the palace was a fortress. It was a very large, very tired building that 500 people worked in, and one man with strong fingers had proved it. Then the money ran out in public. On the 20th November 1992, Windsor Castle caught fire, and the suggestion that taxpayers should meet the whole repair bill collapsed under public fury within days. The solution changed Buckingham Palace forever. In August 1993, the palace's staterooms opened to paying visitors for the first time at £8 a head, explicitly to help fund the Windsor restoration. Hundreds of thousands queued along the railings in the first summer alone. What began as an emergency became an institution. Every summer since, the sovereign's official residence has operated, in plain terms, as a seasonal visitor attraction, and each year the season has grown longer, the tickets dearer, and the argument for keeping the rooms private weaker. The final humiliation was the pipework. By 2016, the palace's boilers, cables and plumbing were more than 60 years old and failing. Our officials briefed openly that the building risked a catastrophic fire or flood, a Windsor in the middle of London. In April 2017, a 10-year reservicing program began, funded by a temporary increase in the sovereign grant at a cost of £369 million, due to complete in March 2027. The scale of the operation says everything about what the building had become. Miles of electrical cabling and pipework stripped out and replaced. Thousands of sockets, light fittings, and radiators renewed. Floors lifted. Whole wings decanted into storage. Curators cataloguing rooms that had not been properly emptied since Queen Mary's day. For the better part of a decade, the house every monarch resented stood half-wrapped in scaffolding, its famous rooms full of dust sheets and contractors' lamps. The East Wing finished first, and in the summer of 2024, the public walked its corridors for the first time in its 175-year history. Nearly 6,000 of them buying guided tours of the very room behind the balcony. The famous front had become the exhibit. All that remained was for someone to say aloud that nobody was coming back to live behind it. But the house that astonishes the tourists at the railings was not built and was never truly kept by the kings and queens whose names are carved into its pediments. It was kept by the roughly 500 people at a time who cooked in it, scrubbed it, accounted for it, and hauled its coal, generation after generation, whether a sovereign was in residence or not. Their presence at Buckingham Palace is documented, recorded in ink on paper, in wage books, works accounts, and household lists. Their stories are not. What follows is reconstruction in the honest sense of the word, built from the pattern of those records. The wages are the kind the books record, the work is the work the books describe, and the silence around each name is real. Consider the clerk of the works from the Nash years, a man of the type the Select Committee papers preserve. Call him John Glover, who kept the daybooks through the whole scandal of the rebuilding. Every load of Bathstone, every gilder's invoice, every one of the pounds that Parliament later raged over, passed through a ledger kept in a freezing sight office for perhaps £200 a year. When the committee demanded to know where £500,000 had gone, it was ledgers like his that answered, line by line, while the architect above him lost his career and the king, above the architect, lost interest. We know the accounts were kept because they survived to be quoted. We know the keeping of them broke no one important. We know nothing else. Consider a housemaid of the wartime household, call her Margaret Doyle, one of the young women on the staff lists at £1 and a few shillings a week with board, who was below stairs on the morning of the 13th of September 1940 when the bombs came through the cloud. The documented accounts of that morning are precise about the family and vague about the staff. 4 workmen injured, 1 fatally, windows out, the chapel gone, and somewhere beneath it all the housemaids sweeping glass out of the corridors by early afternoon because the king and queen were due in the East End and the house had to hold. We know the glass was swept because the household carried on. We know the names of almost none of the women who swept it. And consider the flag sergeant, the man responsible across the middle of the 20th century for the royal standard itself, listed in household records by rank and surname only, Sergeant Ames, his first name never entering the books. For year upon year, his trade was a single piece of national grammar. The standard up when the sovereign was in residence, the standard down when she was not. A man whose whole working life was the difference between a monarch being home and a monarch being elsewhere. The flag he kept now signals, more often than not, an absence. We know his flag. We do not know his face. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. In this house, the silence is deeper than most, because the family itself was so rarely at home. The servants of Buckingham Palace spent whole careers maintaining perfection for rooms that no one entered. The kings resented the house. The house was run by people who were never asked what they felt about it at all. The house absorbed both. We know only that they were there, that the palace they served is still standing, and that some of their names survive because the royal household kept its accounts and nobody threw the books away. On Thursday, 25th June 2026, the royal household published its annual Sovereign Grant Report, the yearly accounting of the public money that funds the monarchy, £132.1 million of it for the year in question. Buried in the briefing that accompanied it was the end of a story that began in 1761. James Chalmers, the keeper of the Privy Purse, told reporters, "I can update you that after careful consideration and to greatly increase opportunities for public access, the King and Queen have decided not to adopt Buckingham Palace as a personal residence." Newspapers, from the Times to the National, spelled out what the careful sentence meant. When the reservicing program completes in March 2027, King Charles III and Queen Camilla will not move in. They will remain at Clarence House, their home since 2003. Private rooms in the palace will be kept for their use during working days and, in the household's phrase, as potential residential accommodation in times ahead, a courtier's way of leaving a door ajar through which no one expects anyone to walk. A palace spokesperson added that the king retains huge affection for Buckingham Palace and a deep respect for its role in royal and public life, and that it would remain a working home while the household sought to widen public access precisely to maximize the national benefit of a publicly funded building. Strip away the tailoring, and the announcement says this: "The era that began when Victoria arrived on 13th of July 1837 is over. 189 years after a teenage queen moved into Nash's beautiful broken palace, the sovereign of the United Kingdom has formally declined to live in Buckingham Palace, and there is no heir behind him waiting to reverse it." William and Catherine settled their family in Windsor at Adelaide Cottage, and then, from late 2025 at Forest Lodge, described across the reporting of that move as their long-term family home. The line of succession runs through Windsor now. It does not run up the Mall. Clarence House, meanwhile, completes a circle almost too neat for fiction. It is a Nash building too, finished in 1827 for the Duke of Clarence, the future William V, the first king to refuse Buckingham Palace. It is a fraction of the palace's size, a house of ordinary rooms where Charles has lived since 2003, first with Camilla as his wife-to-be, then as heir, now as king. 2 centuries separate the sailor king, who would not leave Clarence House for the palace, and the present king, who has decided the same thing. The difference is only that this time the household wrote it down, published it in the accounts, and attached a strategy to it. What the palace becomes instead already has a name in Europe: Versailles. France's great palace has had no resident monarch for more than 2 centuries, and it receives millions of visitors a year, kept magnificent precisely because it is empty, earning its keep from ceremony, spectacle, and ticket sales. Buckingham Palace has been drifting toward that model for 30 years. Around 500,000 people now pass through the staterooms in a good summer. The East Wing tours sell out within hours of release. And the reservicing program was justified to Parliament partly by the promise of longer opening seasons and higher visitor income. The household's own stated reason for the 2026 decision completes the logic. A resident king throttles public access because security shrinks the crowds. An empty palace is worth more to the monarchy than a full one. That sentence would have astonished George IV, and it is now official policy. Consider what the arrangement actually means day to day. Around 500 people will continue to run Buckingham Palace: cleaners, curators, chefs, footmen, gardeners tending the 39 acres behind the walls, clerks in the 92 offices. 775 rooms will be heated, dusted, secured, and conserved. State banquets will still fill the ballroom. Garden parties will still cover the lawns. The balcony will still carry the family on the great occasions. Everything about the palace will continue, except the one thing the word palace is supposed to mean. It will be staffed like a household and inhabited like a museum. And there is a quieter truth inside the official one. The June 2026 statement was not a change of heart. It was the paperwork catching up with 200 years of behavior. George IV never slept there. William IV tried to give it away. Victoria fled it for 40 years. Edward VII alone loved it, and it kept him. George V endured it. George VI shivered in it. Elizabeth II called it the office and left for Windsor. Charles III simply became the first sovereign honest enough to put the family's verdict in an official document. The house every monarch resented has finally been released from the fiction that it was a home. Stand at the railings on a November afternoon. Stand at the railings on a November afternoon when the tour buses have thinned and the light goes flat and grey over the Victoria Memorial, and look at the East Front with this whole story in your eyes. The famous facade is a mask fixed on in 1913, younger than some of the people who have stood here looking at it. The balcony where the family waves belongs to a wing built for Victoria's nurseries and paid for by selling a pleasure palace. The room behind the balcony is on the tour now. The triumphal arch that was meant to be the front gate stands a mile away at the corner of Hyde Park, marooned by traffic. Behind the windows, office lighting, the desks of an institution, not the lamps of a family. Above the roof, the flagpole look longer, and the building starts to confess. The stone joints, where a decade of scaffolding stood, the blast-scarred forecourt rebuilt and rebuilt again, the chapel that is a gallery, the nurseries that are offices, the private apartments that are kept, in the household's careful phrase, available. Nothing you can see from these railings is quite what it claims to be, and it has been that way since a duke raised a boast on a failed silk farm and dared a king to notice. This is the building the world calls the home of the British monarchy, and no British monarch will ever live in it again. Buckingham Palace is not one house. It is the record in red brick, Bath stone and Portland facing of a 3-century argument between what a monarchy must appear to be and where human beings can actually bear to live. Every generation answered the same way, and only one of them, in the end, wrote the answer down. George III wanted privacy. The House gave it to him, and his son spent £700,000 making privacy impossible. George IV wanted immortality. The House gave him a bill, a select committee, and a death at Windsor. William IV wanted never to leave Clarence House. The House waited him out. Victoria wanted a family home. The House gave her a stage, and when the leading man died, she abandoned the theatre for 40 years. Edward VII wanted a theatre, and the House obliged him twice, at his birth and at his death. George V wanted a cottage. George VI wanted warmth. Elizabeth II wanted Windsor, and Charles III wanted at last to say so in public. The House gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The House always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. And beneath the sovereigns, always the staff, the clerk of the works who counted the scandal into his ledgers, the housemaid sweeping bomb glass from the corridors before the afternoon engagements, Sergeant Ames raising a flag whose whole meaning is now inverted. Around 500 people still run this house. They polish floors no family walks on, keep bedrooms no one sleeps in, maintain in perfect order an act of curated memory 775 rooms deep. So, who does a building belong to? The Duke, who built it to taunt a palace, the King, who bought it to hide in, the King, who ruined himself gilding it, the Queen, who fled it, the one King who died where he was born inside it, the women who swept its wartime glass, the 500 who keep it now, the tourists at the railings who fund it, or the King who finally told the truth about it. Buckingham Palace does not answer. The House never answers. It simply stands at the end of its long red avenue behind its borrowed face and lets you decide one image, then, to leave in. Look up past the balcony to the flagpole on the roof. For 189 years, the royal standard on that pole meant one simple thing, understood by every Londoner and every visitor. The sovereign is home. From now on, it will mean only that the sovereign is visiting, a protocol of appointments raised for working hours in a house whose bedrooms belong to the past. The flag still flies. The king still waves. Nobody lives there. Nobody ever will again. It is still up there. It always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.